Hello, in this video I'm going to give you a very broad overview of all of the components that are involved in a typical quadcopter build, and I'll explain what is the purpose of each of them. And I've made a diagram that we can look at while I'm talking about that might make things a little bit clearer as to how they're all connected. But before we look at that, I thought I might take a small step backwards and point out what may be obvious to a lot of people watching this already. But I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page before we move forward. And what I want to talk about just for a moment is the physics of how these things fly. How do they actually, make the movements that they make? So obviously they fly by spinning the propellers. There's no propellers on here, but the motors will spin around. And when the motors all spin at the same speed, or if you increase the speed of the motors altogether, that will obviously lift the quad up and down. So it'll accelerate it upwards. And when you want to come down, you have to use gravity to return you back down. Well, technically you could turn upside down and accelerate downwards, but that's a little beyond the scope of this video series. So to do actual maneuvering around other than just going up and down, you need to split the speed of the motors to different ratios. So for example, if you spin the two motors on the right faster than you spin the motors on the left, that will cause the quad to roll in that direction, and vice versa if you spin these motors faster. And of course the same is true for pitch. So the two motors at the front spinning faster will tip it backwards, and the two motors at the back spinning faster will tip it forwards. That's probably pretty obvious. What's probably not quite so obvious is how we get a yaw movement like that. So I'll just demonstrate how that works with this other quad that I've got set up. So here I have this nylon frame with just one motor attached, and I'm sitting it on a piece of baking paper, sort of a little bit like wax paper, just so that it has a lower friction and it's able to slide a little bit easier on the desk. And I have the servo controller thingy over here that I can use to control this motor, and you'll notice that especially when I start and stop it quickly, the rotational inertia of this, or the torque if you prefer, is causing the whole frame to move when I turn it on. And if this was floating in the air, if there was like no friction at all from the surface, you can imagine that this would just spin a lot more. It would just keep spinning like that. So basically that's how the yaw movement is done, except with four motors you can control it a little bit better. You're not just like jerking it on and off. You have a much smoother control. So each of these axes of control, the roll, the pitch, the yaw, and the throttle or the thrust, are split into channels on your transmitter so that you can control them separately. And it's the job of the flight controller to set the speed of each individual motor to be just right to match up with what you are telling the quad that it should be doing. Okay, now let's take a look at this diagram. This is not supposed to be a wiring diagram or anything like that. It's just a broad overview to give you a general idea of which things are connected to which. And don't be too discouraged if it looks like there's a lot of things on here. Not everything on here is necessary to build a basic quad and fly it. For example, the things down the bottom here with the dark red text. All of these things are only necessary if you actually want to have a camera on there and fly FPV. And a lot of these things with the dotted lines are not necessary either. And so even some of these things with the solid lines are also in some cases not necessary either. So it's not as bad as it looks. And you may have been able to guess from these two regions separated into blue and green that the stuff in the blue region is things that will be on the quadcopter flying around in the air, and things down on the green side, this is what's going to be on the ground. Either you're holding this in your hands or wearing it on your face in the case of goggles. Alright, so starting with the power source, obviously we're going to need some kind of a battery to get this whole thing running, but this is not just any kind of battery. You're not going to be able to run a quadcopter like this from the AA's that are in your TV remote control or anything like that. We need a pretty high performance battery that can output a lot of energy very quickly and is also light and compact as well. And in pretty much every case this is going to be a lithium polymer battery. Just quickly show you one of these. This is a pretty typical one here. It has some funny connectors on here that you may not be familiar with, but we'll take a look at the details of all this later on. Over on the output side we have motors and ESCs, and we need 4 each of these. The motors should be pretty obvious what they do. They just spin around and around. And ESC stands for electronic speed control. So 1 speed control per motor is required to tell each motor individually how fast it should spin. And the instructions to the ESCs for how fast they should tell the motors to spin is coming from the flight controller. So there's 4 connections between the flight controller and the ESCs, or one each. And these red connections up here signify power. So in this diagram I've taken the convention of drawing lines in red where it's predominantly a power connection, and the green lines are predominantly a signal or some kind of instruction. It's not really power as such. And we saw a couple of examples of these just before. This is a motor, brushless motor, and this is a typical ESC. It's just a sort of a circuit board thing, bunch of stuff on the back, and we will look at those in detail as well later on. Now, sitting in the middle we have the flight controller, which is like the central hub that brings everything together. It's kind of like the brain of the quad, and its main job is to feed information to the ESCs continuously to tell them how fast each motor should be spinning right now. But it can do a whole lot of other things as well. It's basically a little computer. Let's just look at a couple of these now. Well, when I say it's a computer, it's just one of these circuit board things, and there is a big chip on there which is the CPU, so that's where all the stuff is happening, and there'll be some other things on here which are sensors, like we'll look at in a second. And got some little lights there, not much on the back of that one. You can get them with more or less sensors. This one actually has a barometer on there, little tiny barometer, and it has a SD card reader writer on there, and they'll typically have a USB plug for connecting to your computer to change the settings and so on. So that's what I mean when I say flight controller. Now, as far as the sensors go, typically there will be a gyroscope and an accelerometer. These are on pretty much every flight controller that I've seen that I can remember. And the gyroscope will measure angular rotation, so it will be able to tell how fast the frame of the quad is rotating. So if you're telling the quad that it should be sitting still and it senses that it's rotating, it knows, it can sense that, and it will know how fast to spin the motors to make a correction. Accelerometer, very broadly speaking, an accelerometer will let the quad know which way is up or which way is down, whatever you like. And this will be necessary if you want to have an auto level feature, where if you just let go of the stick, your quad will automatically level itself again instead of turning upside down and crashing. Then you'll need an accelerometer. Now, the ones that I've grayed out here are sometimes not on a flight controller board, especially not the cheaper ones. A barometer will sense air pressure, and air pressure changes with altitude. So as you go up, the air pressure is less because the air is less dense up there. So this will let the quad know if, as it's moving up and down, it will be able to sense that it's moving up and down. And the point of this is that it will be able to stay at a fixed altitude. If you just tell it to sit there at a certain altitude, it will be able to stay there. Or it can, move up and down. If you say move 5 meters up, it will be able to roughly move 5 meters up. We can also have magnetometer, which is a fancy name for a compass. This will let the quad know which way is north or south, west, and so on. And a GPS, which will let it know where it is on the planet. And typically these are not on most flight controller boards. They're more commonly used separately. That's why I've put them in this separate little box. And you can buy GPS and compass together as one module. And the reason for that is they need to be kept a little bit further away from everything else, because they can suffer from magnetic interference from the motors in the ESCs. They can kind of mess up the readings that these sensors get. So typically you'll buy this as a separate component, and you'll stick it on somewhere else and have some wiring to connect them. So that's why I've put it out as a separate component. And obviously the point of these is that you can do sort of autonomous functions, like you can tell the quad, go and fly over there, and because it has a GPS and a compass, it knows how to get there, and then it can return to home automatically, and it can do position hold and just stay in one place without you needing to control it and so on. But I'm not going to be looking at that in this video series. I may make a follow-up where I do something with these, but for now we're just going to ignore these sensors, and we're not going to look at barometers either. We're just going to be looking at these ones in blue, the very, very basic flying sensors. Okay, over here we have receiver, and this is often abbreviated as RX, especially if you're typing for, you know, conversations and online forums and so on. It's just a little bit shorter to write it that way. And this is connected to the flight controller, and it's also connected to the transmitter, which is often called just a radio, or again TX for short. And you're holding this in your hand, and the receiver is receiving instructions from you and passing that on to the flight controller to tell it what you want to do. So hopefully that should be pretty obvious how that works. Just to have a look at a couple of examples of a receiver. This is one that I use most commonly, and it has a 6-channel receiver, so we have these channels marked on here. So I can use 4 channels for my stick controls, and then I can have a couple of extra channels to have some switches to do other things as well. But depending on what you're trying to put this on, you may find that this is a little bit too big. For example, this one over here, I don't think it would fit very well on this quad. So you can get these in all shapes and sizes, and this one I have on here is a lot smaller. But you're sort of sacrificing reception as well. So this one, you wouldn't be able to go as far away and get as good signal as you can with this one here. It's sort of, you know, they're made for different purposes. And obviously, this is what a transmitter looks like. By the way, I've drawn this arrow here showing that the primary direction of the radio transmission is from the transmitter to the receiver. But in many of these modern systems that we have now, there's actually also information going back from the receiver to the transmitter, and that is often referred to as telemetry, because telemetry means tele is distance, metry is measuring or something like that. So usually we use this to measure or send some information back about what's going on over here. The most important thing I can think of would be the battery voltage. You want to know how much battery you have left while you're flying, but telemetry could be all kinds of other information as well. So just keep in mind that information can also go back this direction. Right, over on this side we have buzzer. This is something that I've listed as an optional component with these dotted lines, but you really want to have a buzzer on there of some kind while you're flying. The buzzer serves 2 purposes. One is to let you know when the battery is getting low, and also if you crash somewhere, it can be very helpful to have something buzzing, making a sound as you're looking for it, to help you find it. Now I've drawn 2 lines here, one's going to the battery and one's going to the flight controller, but this will be an either or. You're going to be either this one or that one, depending on what kind of a buzzer you're using. So I'll just show you a couple of different types of buzzers. This is one that would connect directly to your battery, and all this is going to do is beep when the battery level gets low, and it's very loud. So usually I cover this up here to stop it from being noisy, but I'll just show you how loud it is. It's pretty loud. And then it'll show you these 3 green lights when everything's okay, and then they'll start to flash red over here when they're not okay, and then when the battery level in one of the cells gets too low, it will start making that really loud beeping again. So it can be useful for finding the quad. If you crash somewhere and you are willing to wait around long enough that the battery level drains out to the point where it starts beeping, this can help you find the quad as well. But I tend not to use these too much these days, because you can get buzzers that, this is a smaller buzzer that will connect directly to the flight controller, and this is a 5-volt buzzer, so it's much quieter, but as long as you're within a reasonable distance of it, you can still hear it. But the reason why this is more useful than the other one is because being connected to the flight controller, it can make all different kinds of beeps, and it can give you beeps at different times, and you can intentionally make it beep. So if you're walking around trying to find your quad, you can tell this beep, and then you can tell it to shut up, and then you can tell it to beep again. Just whenever you feel like you want to make it beep, you can do that. So this is not as loud. Let me just connect this up, and you'll hear so each of those signals there has a meaning. So it's more, I'd call it a little bit more intelligent than this one, which is kind of dumb. It just does a beep and that's it. But this will beep when you switch modes and all different kinds of things. Much more useful. Okay, let's have a look at this thing here, BEC or BEC. This stands for Battery Eliminator Circuit, also called voltage regulator or voltage step down. This exists to take the relatively high voltage of the battery, which is around about 12 to 16 volts in most cases, and regulate it or step it down to 5 volts, which is what the flight controller will typically be able to accept. So you can't just connect the battery directly to your flight controller, as you'll probably damage something on the flight controller. Some flight controllers are starting to come out more and more that can actually handle up to, say, 16, 17 volts directly, so that you don't actually need this spec, which is quite convenient. That's why I said at the beginning of this video, not even this one here is maybe not necessary in some cases. You may also find that some ESCs include a BEC inside them, so you don't need a separate BEC over here. You can just connect your flight controller up to the BEC that's inside the ESCs and get your 5 volt power from there. So let's have a quick look at an example of one of these things so we can see what they look like. And you may have noticed when I was showing you the buzzer just before that there's this little thing in the wires here, and this is actually a voltage regulator. So it's taking the 12 volts from this battery and stepping it down to 5 volts in this case for the flight controller. This is what you might call a standalone voltage regulator. It's typically not what you'd be using on a quadcopter because, as I said, sometimes the BEC is inside the ESC already, so you don't need it. And you can also find BECs as part of other components too, which we'll look at in a minute. So, onto the FPV stuff down the bottom here. This is, of course, only necessary if you actually want to fly your quadcopter in first-person view. So on the quad we obviously need a camera, and then we connect that to a video transmitter to send the picture back to the ground. And I've connected these up with dotted lines to the battery, showing that they need power, of course. These days a lot of cameras and video transmitters are coming out that can be connected directly to battery power, so even a high voltage battery like 16, 17 volts, the FPV camera and the transmitter will be able to handle it. Back in the day, back in the days not that long ago, like a year and a half ago maybe, a lot of cameras were still requiring a specific voltage, usually about 12 volts or thereabouts. And if you have one of those older cameras, you'll need to have some kind of a voltage regulator step down in the middle here, like you'll need a BEC, another BEC maybe, in here to make sure that your FPV camera is getting the right voltage. So let's have a look at a camera and a transmitter, typical case. This is one of the ones that I was just saying that can actually handle, it says on the back there, 5 to 17 volts. So there's just some connectors there, and that will connect up to the video transmitter, which is another one of these circuit boardy things. There's lots of circuit boardy things in this build, isn't there? And that will receive the signal from the camera on there, and then we also need an antenna, which is typically going to be one of these cloverleaf style antennas, and that will be connected up there to propagate the radio signal out nicely. I should maybe also mention that these days you can find these camera, video transmitter and antenna combos all as one single unit, and quite small and quite cheap as well. So this might be something that you could use. You can quite easily take it off your quad and put it onto something else, and it's very easy to power as well. Probably not something I'd recommend as a long-term solution. I mean, the picture is just sort of okay-ish, and you can get better range and signal from a proper setup like that. So down on the ground we're going to need something to receive this signal and look at it. So we need a video receiver and either a screen or goggles of some kind. And this is where personal preference comes into it a bit. I think some people prefer to use a screen, other people prefer to use goggles. And another big differentiating factor here is money. You can pay a lot for the top-end goggles, but you can actually get a pretty decent FPV screen for $40, $50 or somewhere around there. And these days they're coming out more and more commonly as one unit, so you don't necessarily need to buy goggles and then attach a video receiver, but it wasn't that long ago that that was still fairly common. So for the sake of looking at each of these things individually, I'll just show you some things here that I have of each sort of configuration. This is something that I used a while ago. I haven't used this recently because all this stuff is all getting cheaper, but this is a separate video receiver, and again you would need to put an antenna on there to receive the signal properly. And then this is plugged into a screen where you can look at this and put this huge box on the front of your face. And I preferred this face box style thing for quite a while, but now that I've gotten used to the goggles, I think I'm okay with either. I don't really mind. too much either way. Just whichever one you get used to seems to work for me. But yeah, since it's all a lot cheaper now, you're probably not likely to be buying something like that. For what is now actually a cheaper price, you can get something like this, which has the receiver and the goggles together. It's a smaller screen, so it's not quite such a nice view as the other one, but it's really cheap. This is around $50, I think, and it's a lot more convenient to carry around with you and to just sort of prop up on top of your head when you're not using it and so on. And then after that, you're looking at, well, the only other thing I have to show you, I guess, is these sort of goggles. So you may have seen these around a lot. This is, I'd say if you have the money, this is really what you want to get eventually. So yeah, these are now, you're looking at 2 individual screens in there, and overall I find this just much more convenient. It's a lot smaller and lighter and more compact. Now if you prefer looking at a screen, you can just you can actually take the screen out of this kind of thing, put it on a tripod and use that with your receiver. That works quite well. You might want to do that when you first start flying FPV so that you can just quickly look at the quad normally instead of panicking and having to pull your goggles off and try and find it and so on. But if you prefer looking at a screen long term, you might want to invest in something like this, which this is quite a nice one. It has everything all in one unit, so it actually has a video recorder in it as well and automatic channel searching. So some people like to put one of these up on a tripod and fly like that. Whoops. But this, I think this is about $100, so it's not something that you'd probably want to get if you are thinking about going in the goggles direction. You might want to just spend the money on goggles instead. Now there's one other commonly used component that I haven't put in here anywhere, and that's because, again, it's not really necessary. But if you look at these wires here coming from the battery to the ESC, they sort of come along here and then they split up. So you've got to have 4 wires, or actually 8, because you need a positive and a negative for each of these. So you've got to have 8 wires coming into one somehow, and there's nothing to stop you sort of holding this together, carefully soldering it up so that it stays into one sort of block, and that will work fine. I've done that before, but in most cases it's much more easy to use something that's known as a power distribution board, or PDB for short, and I've got a couple of these here. This is about as simple as you can get. I think all you do is you take your wires from, well, positive goes on there, there, and there, negatives go on the other one, and this will just bring everything into one same location so that you don't need to make a messy soldering job of your own. And that's about all there is on this one. This one has a few more things on it, and if I can just focus it here. See if that focuses while I'm grabbing this other piece, because I just wanted to put this side by side with this other thing. Remember this beck that we were looking at before? If I put that on there, you may notice some similarities between these two. At least the top half of the PDB is kind of the same as the beck, and that's because this PDB has a beck on it. So that's what I was saying before. Sometimes you can find a beck in other components. So this is a double convenience, because now we can connect all our ESCs up here together, and we have a 5 volt, in this case, beck to power our flight controller with it. And we also actually have a 12 volt on here. So remember what I said just before, some of the older FPV cameras, they sometimes needed to have a beck to regulate their voltage down to 12 volts instead of connecting directly to the battery. These days you're probably not going to use this, but I mean, it's there if you wanted 12 volts to power something. So this is a hugely convenient thing to have. There you go, beck, 5 volts, and it's actually showing you how much current it can handle as well. Anyway, so that's a PDB, and you're probably going to want to use this on your build as well. Well, there we go. I think that's about all I wanted to cover for this video. Like I say, it's not details. We'll get to the details later. I just wanted to make sure everybody had a common ground before we move on. So I thought it might be interesting for the newcomers who are not familiar with all these jargon terms like BC and PDB and ESC and all this stuff. Might be interesting for them to actually take a look at each component individually and get an idea for how everything fits together before we get into the nitty-gritty of the rest of it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.